Cynthia and I were very honored to have Anton join us once again for Rising Tide Foundation weekly lecture. Obviously today, I mean, we're living through a moment in history which is just ripe with potential, both for the good and for evil. We see that there is a lot of confusion in a lot of the better Americans, especially, and also Canadians, people who actually have access to a certain patriotic instinct and are willing to fight right now against this color revolutionary process underway to overthrow nation states, are being induced to increasingly believe that the arch nemesis of America and of Canada and the free world is China and secondarily Venezuela and Iran. And I mean, the level of misinformation being spread through this sort of zeitgeist right now is conscious. It's only successful to the degree that people don't have a grasp of historical context. So, I mean, many people, especially over the course of the Cold War period, were led to believe that really they have a choice of either being, on the one side, sort of like a socialist, that's not even the right word for it, but somebody favorable to social engineering top-down policies, like we see coming out of certain factions within one party in the US, or radical libertarian, individualistic, antagonistic to all federal government ideas. Which you see in a lot of, not everybody, but a lot of like the Trump support base. That is a false dichotomy. The fact is that the US Constitution is based upon a principle of the general welfare. It's the first nation to enshrine the sacredness of individual liberty. And both the individual liberty as well as the general welfare of the whole together are one idea that requires both an understanding of a nation's history, of its raison d'etre, as well as its purpose for the future. So Anton Chaitkin is a renowned historian, somebody I've been honored to know for many years. His work going back through the 1970s and 80s, his research has pieced together the true nature of this thing that today has been increasingly dubbed deep state. It didn't have that name when Anton Chaitkin wrote Treason in America back in 1984. But of course, what he lays out in that incredible manuscript is really the structure of the British intelligence and financial operations permeated deeply within the United States on every level, as well as other countries, which has more relevance for today than people realize. Recently, just a few weeks ago, Anton has added to our understanding of history with the publication of Volume 1 of Who We Are. It's a book that is now available on Kindle and paperback on Anton's website. Which I think a few of us here in the audience have already had a chance to purchase and read. So I'd encourage everybody to do that. Anton will now grace us with some of the content and some big ideas, and then we'll just open up for dialogue Q&A after that. So Anton, it's all yours.
Thank you, Matt. Great. Since the people listening to this are all of in a different genre of mental acuity, I can get into things that I wouldn't get into in doing it like a, I don't know, a radio interview or something. So this book is the first account ever published, if not written, of the Industrial Revolution as a project of US leaders. You need to understand that to start with, not only what it is about, but that it is the first one to be written. Whatever the quality of my work, I put a lot into it, but you have to see the unique situation that this is based on new work, and it's a response to the crisis that's facing mankind now. That's how this was written. If we were to return to the outlook that I have shown that people had in the past in the United States, the outlook in favor of industrial progress, that would, if we return to that, that would address this crisis that now threatens to destroy our civilization. And I mean the moral outlook of the leading patriot activists that I told about. I'm gonna go through a few of the things that they did and how they thought, so that you see what that outlook actually was. The action in the book picks up towards the end of the book, and I don't know if you call it a coda or whatever you call it, but the stretto, the biggest action, the most important action is the last 2.5 chapters, where the Industrial Revolution takes place, the first phase. Before that, in the time of Hamilton, in 1792, Hamilton's father-in-law, General Schuyler, began building the Erie Canal, America's first canal, as a private enterprise. It was the Hamilton family. He was deeply involved in that enterprise, the planning for it and so forth, as Washington had been. 2 years, and he was hoping for government to come in and take it over, really, or to pay for it. 2 years later, a young New York State political leader named DeWitt Clinton gave a speech that was a prophecy, and I'm gonna read this. It's just one paragraph prophecy. DeWitt Clinton: great improvements must take place, which far surpass the momentum of power that a single nation can produce, but will proceed from their united strength. The hand of art will change the face of the universe. Mountains, deserts, and oceans will feel its mighty force. It will not be debated whether hills shall be prostrated, but whether the Alps and the Andes shall be leveled, nor whether sterile fields should be fertilized, but whether the deserts of Africa shall feel the power of cultivation, nor whether rivers shall be joined, but whether the Caspian shall see the Mediterranean and the waves of the Pacific wash the Atlantic shores. DeWitt Clinton later successfully fought for New York State to build the Erie Canal. He was the governor who organized the whole project. Then we have Nicholas Biddle, who was, in this period of the climax of my book, was one of the leaders. The men I'm talking about, I have 6 people who I've designated as the chief strategists of industrialization of the United States in the first phase. So the next one is Nicholas Biddle, who was president of the Bank of the United States. His mind was the American Revolution. People in his family were very courageous fighters in the Revolution, officers. His father was Benjamin Franklin's vice president. They had a president and vice president of the state of Pennsylvania. President Washington lived on his street when he was a child. So this was in his mind. In 1810, Biddle was focused on the British attacks against a very weak US, and it was weak militarily and economically. And he warned that if Hamilton's Bank of the United States were shut down, financiers would get predatory power. I'm not saying this to concentrate on the technicalities of the program, but I want you to see the state of mind. That's the important thing. This is what he said at that time, 1810. Without credit or money, if you shut down the government's bank, without credit or money, while your commerce is stopped and your manufactures collapse, in the total want of money, the demand for gold will place the poorer classes at the mercy of the rich. And the great moneylenders will come out to prey upon their fellow citizens. The only beings who will be seen floating on the wreck are those very moneyed aristocrats whom the anti-bank demagogues denounce with such indignation. Nicholas Biddle later legislated in the state legislature the first coal-carrying canal and organized the greatest coal-carrying railroad in the world, Reading Railroad. He personally organized that. In addition to being president of the Bank of the United States, which he ran to secure investment into economic progress while limiting dangerous financial speculation. Matthew Carey, risked his life to free Ireland. He escaped with his life from Ireland. Before he came to America, he printed revolutionary literature for Benjamin Franklin in Paris. In exile in the United States, he promoted Hamilton's banking and became the leading publisher in the country. He promoted industrial protectionism and infrastructure and revived it in the 19th century. Revived that program later on after Hamilton was dead. Why? He was a publisher, not a manufacturer. This was not self-interest. Henry Clay, he is probably the most famous of these people. Henry Clay's mind was shaped by years as the secretary and private student of a man named George Wythe, W-Y-T-H-E, who was a Greek classicist and the leading bold American Revolution figure in the South during the American Revolution. He was also anti-slavery, and that's what he taught to Clay. So Henry Clay told the public that the slave owners, and he lived in a slave state, he told the country that the slave owners had a pact with the British to stop US industrialization. Henry Clay rallied the country to defend against British attacks. He pushed through the laws that promoted manufacturing and great engineering projects.
Oh, God. John, see, this thing is not the easiest fucking
Can you hear me?
to navigate.
Yeah, are we okay? Matt? I gotta make sure that I'm connected here.
I can hear you.
You're
Yeah,
okay?
you're connected. I think that was
you're okay. Yeah,
Okay.
somebody just walked in. They didn't know how to mute.
We
So
can
it's
hear
fine.
you.
So,
I can hear you myself.
so Clay, again, now you may have heard of Clay in Canada because he was the leader of the drive to get a war against Britain, a defensive war in 1812. And Canadian and British literature on the subject depicts the war as a war of conquest against Canada by the United States. That is a complete misconception. It was a war against the British Empire that was using the areas just above the United States as a base for British military organization and supply of Indian attacks across the whole United States territory. The famous very brave Indian leader, Tecumseh, was sponsored by the British. And I have an extensive coverage of that in this book. Tecumseh died as a British general in the War of 1812. But Henry Clay was opposed to war against Mexico. And that was a war of conquest run by the slave owners who at that time, later in the 1840s, had control over US government. Clay opposed that. He was the leader of attacking that. The work of Biddle, Carey, and Clay led directly to the creation of the modern iron industry in the United States. That is, we had not advanced beyond, and in many ways we're below what it was in the colonial period. But then finally in the in the 1830s and 40s, as a result of these guys' efforts, we suddenly got a quadrupled and modern technology iron industry. The coal mining industry was started up by Carey and Biddle. There was no commercial coal mining before they did these things that I was describing, the canals, railroads, and certain other things. Then you have John Quincy Adams. Here, I want you to understand his mental map. As Secretary of State in 1821, he said, "It was a fundamental axiom of American policy that looks forward to the downfall of the British Empire in India as an event which must necessarily follow at no very distant period of time. That great colonial establishments are mighty engines of wrong in the progress of social improvement. It will be the duty of the human family to abolish them, as they are now trying to abolish the slave trade." Then, as president, that same man, Adams, assigned Army engineers to design the first American railroads. When there was a crisis in Oregon between the British and the Americans as to who would control it, the British didn't want to settle it, just wanted to control it. There was a question about whether we should go to war with them, or at least prepare for war with Britain so that we could settle Oregon. The slave owners wanted to make a deal with Britain, give them half of the Pacific coast, and make war on Mexico to steal their land, kill the Hispanics, and populate North America with slaves. So John Quincy Adams said, if necessary, we should fight the British. And going to war against Mexico is treason to the United States. Most importantly, Clinton, Carey, Biddle, Adams, and Clay stood up against the Southern slave owners, consistently fighting them in order to put through their economic program. That's the history of the industrialization of the country. It's a direct fight against those who would lose everything if the country got industrialized, because you can't have low efficiency slave agriculture and slave labor when you have high profit, high wage, high skill industry as the dominant feature of national life. So it's either one or the other. The last person I'll mention is General Joseph Gardner Swift, who plays a leading role in this book. His mind was formed by his family's role in the Boston Tea Party and the American Revolution. His grandfather died as a British prisoner in Massachusetts. General Swift's mentor was the first superintendent of West Point, And Swift became the second superintendent of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. His mentor was Benjamin Franklin's aide and nephew, Jonathan Williams. So this guy Swift, with the revolution in his whole soul, organized the transformation of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point to train world-leading civil engineers. And the ones that were then later assigned by President Adams to build America's first railroads, to design them. General Swift also set up a manufacturing establishment as an adjunct to West Point. It was called the West Point Foundry, and it was interlocked with the military academy. And they, on the pretext of, not just the pretext, but the assignment of contracts to build cannons for the US defense, that foundry manufactured the first US locomotives. They also built ships. They also built engines for steam engines. They built the pipes and the fittings for the canals. General Swift's work, his personal mentorship and his reorganization of the military for this purpose helped bring about the building of Russia's first railroad, which was built by an American Army engineer, and the locomotives and rolling stock were built by people from Philadelphia. Now, a U.S. industrial development outlook like these men who actually built the USA would get the support of a big majority of voters. Think about it. I think 80%. Because it represents the obvious interest of the people themselves. You're going to supply jobs, you're going to supply high wages, because the kind of jobs that you need in a modern economy are skilled jobs. So that means that you do everything to upgrade the labor force. You have to give a lot to get a lot. You have to give very good incentive to the people at the lowest part of the totem pole to make that work out. But the skilled workers would obviously benefit as well, and manufacturers. So, okay, if it would get a large vote, and you would have a government that would have public support, and you wouldn't be so polarized. But how would that outlook solve the crisis that now threatens our civilization? Think of the image of man in their minds. The man in India that John Quincy Adams says should not be under British oppression. The man in the United States, whether it's a slave or it's an unemployed worker, or it's some guy who could be, engineering great things or building manufacturing plants. He has the image of human beings throughout the world in his mind. It's universal. And all these men are explicit about the scope of their thinking, going back through history to man's achievements. They are all acquainted with classical culture, classical music, classical literature, Plato and other things, the great tragedies. General Swift was the founder of the Handel and Haydn Society in New York and co-founder of the New York Philharmonic Orchestra. I just got an email this morning from Senator Rand Paul, I'm on the email list there. And he said that the Congress had just passed a rotten bill or a resolution. I wasn't clear about it. They're attempting to prohibit the president from withdrawing US troops from Afghanistan without the approval of Congress. You can't do that unless we say so. And Senator Rand Paul comments that they do that while also keeping the precedent in place that the president is free to start a war without consulting Congress. So they're acting in a direct way to keep the perpetual war going. So what is in the mind, what image of man is in the mind of the congressman who acts to keep that war going? What is the image in his mind of the Afghans, the people there, or of the US soldiers who go there? It's obvious that there is no image whatsoever. There's calculation, there's opinion. There may be fear of somebody, who would hurt them if they don't do that. But there's no image of man. There's no image of the specific people there, let alone an image of the future. They're not thinking of they may be thinking of their own grandchildren, but they're not thinking in a realistic way. So if we go back then to this book, these men that whose story I told, I give a succinct biography of the people who organized the industrialization of the United States, the change from a smaller, weak, and more backward economy to build a modern industrial state. They saw man's dignity as something that had to be protected. They saw it as in God's image. They were all proceeding from what I would say was a true Christian point of view, although I'm not an expert on that. But I know the way they thought, and I know what their philosophy was. They saw man's right to have a bright and noble future, because that's who man is. That's the way they thought about it. And that future would be conquering nature and exploring the universe. So we have to return to that which built America. And this book shows what it was. And I'm waiting for people to contradict the story, the facts as presented. Because I think they're gonna have a tough time. So I'm hoping that the steps that are being taken, I and some friends have been working pretty hard to get this out. I have some friends that have helped me do this. I wrote it, but it's not that easy to actually publish a book, technically, and some of it costs money. I'm not even talking about advertising. So we're trying to get this to break containment, but it has some secret weapons. And the main thing is that it's completely unique as the first account of how the United States actually became a great power. I'm going to complete that story from Lincoln to Kennedy in the second volume. So let me leave it at that, and let's open it up for questions. But I hope that you could address some of the things that I've talked about.
Thank you, Anton, for this wonderful introduction to your book and to universal history. With that, I would just start. Hold on, we got Martin Seif entering the room here. Anybody who wants to pose a question or share a thought with Anton, I think the best thing to do to keep it orderly is to maybe write a message in the chat section to put your name on, and then I'll just call on people individually so that it's not just a big rush to say something. So, do people see how to use the chat?
I don't see the chat.
Strangely enough, I don't either. Where? Oh, okay. That plan might have not worked out.
It's usually there.
Let's
Yeah,
see.
it's usually there.
I'm on. Can I make it? I have a question. I'm on audio, but
Yeah.
because my computer's inside, it's on charge. I'm sitting outside on my cell phone.
Who is this?
But this is Bill Warwick, and basically what I have one comment and two, and second two is about the American system and MMT. I mean, the president is the commander in chief. This resolution is unconstitutional. He can just tell the Pentagon, bring the troops home now. I'm the commander in chief, and that's what happened.
Yeah, that's true.
I don't know. Rand Paul is correct in what to do with the troops.
I don't know if he'd get away with it. Kennedy was trying to pull the troops out of Vietnam, remember?
Right, but there was a whole thing in place to kill him. But my other thing is with this MMT and the American system. Jimmy Dore had a guy on the other night who was explaining modern monetary theory, and basically what it is when the economy is in decline, you have to inject money into people's pockets so they can spend and improve the economy, which is correct. But he doesn't understand that you've got to do something with that money. He didn't really explain that, and that's what the American system is. The American system issued credit, and the credit was used to build things that were going to make money later. But it also put money in the people's hands who were working on whatever the project was. So that's how you have to marry MMT and the American system. And that's the way I understand it.
Would you humor me by spelling out what that MMT stands for?
Oh, modern monetary theory.
Modern monetary theory. That sounds like something out of Gilbert and Sullivan.
No, it's not. All it is when the economy is in decline, it's because people don't have money to spend. They're borrowed up to their necks, and they can't borrow anything. So their salaries are inadequate to sustain them. So they can't spend anything, and so the economy starts to decline. Well, with modern monetary theory, you inject money into the economy, but what this guy didn't explain, and this was on Jimmy Dore just last week, or this maybe it was early this week. It may have been Monday or Tuesday this week. So go to Jimmy Dore's YouTube and the talk monetary theory. And it's not. It's no more than a week old. It was.
Okay, Bill. You're breaking up there a little bit, but I think the idea was very well communicated, so that's definitely worth pursuing. Anton, yeah.
I'd like to take that up for a minute.
Yeah.
John Maynard Keynes was a proponent of that kind of stimulus as a antidote to depression, economic depression. Keynes himself was a Malthusian. Not everybody who believes in economic stimulus is a Malthusian, but what Keynes deliberately avoided, and what the other people don't know about, which is obvious once you get the idea. It's obvious that this is a fatal oversight, is what is the actual history of the economy? Not the theory of the economy. How did the economy progress ever? How did people get high living standards? How did people get living standards that were sustained over a longer period of time than otherwise? It has to do with the intention to promote this increase in the skill, the knowledge, and the applied powers of man over nature. All of those things together. And that's the history, not the theory. My book is not a theory. I don't go, I mean, it's lacking in certain respects that are obvious. I do not go back into the prehistory of this period, into those whose thinking and works were essential to develop what Franklin and others came up with. And I did go into Colbert, obviously. But what about Leibniz? What about the philosophers and the statesmen who preceded the modern period? But what I have done, and what I think has to be demanded in any discussion about what we ought to do, is to say, look, most of mankind is presently suffering from poverty, disease, and war, in particular, disastrous, impoverished circumstances, whether it's caused by endemic poverty or by war or by disease or whatever it is. Most of mankind is nearly demolished. A lot of mankind is in that condition now, and it's threatening to get much worse. What has ever been done about that? Do you think the world can continue like this? No, it's obvious it can't. So when you have a theory about the role of government or about what you should do with money to make things better, people have to demand that you refer to the history of the subject, which is the economy. I don't think you have to go into, you don't have to say, tell me about the history of factories, although that's part of it. But you have to have some reference to the fight that has taken place over the ages, but also in modern times, between the two sides. One wanted to have both industrial progress and a high wage economy and rescue the poor. That's one side altogether. There were some people who wanted to have, build factories, but wanted to pay low wages. But they're not the ones who organized the creation of this economy or sustained it. Often they ended up destroying it. So you have two sides. One side builds the economy and is responsible for solving the problems. Always. We had these guys in the 19th century. You had them in every country. You had some in Canada. You had some in France. You had people that I'm not discussing now. But then you had a new feature of this whole process with Franklin Roosevelt and later Kennedy. And there were people who were their allies in other countries that Matt's written about, that other people know about in Europe and elsewhere, and in the Commonwealth. But Roosevelt was in a position to revive the spirit of these earlier people. No discussion of economics or of monetary theory is either competent or honest. And it's usually filthy if it does not refer to the history of the general welfare. And I've got that history, at least the core of it, in this book. Refer to some other account if you want to. That's fine. I'm not the only one who's written about these subjects, but they haven't done it in the way I've done it. Fine. I'm looking for every lead I can get to keep working on this. And it's just the beginning of this account, really, because you got to go much deeper to see what was really going on. And there's some other subjects that are very close to this that have to do with the treatment of people that were not in this civilization, but which we wanted to be in. The American Indians and the black slaves taken out of Africa. You have to take up those questions. They're central to this whole story. So, but this problem that you have to demand the actual history of the economy be immediately referred to in any kind of theoretical discussion or any kind of advocacy. Otherwise, it's completely dishonest. You're being played for a fool.
I have a question from, hold on, Stephen, I got you now on the list, but I've got so far Pascal and Nick on the list. So Pascal, you were the first I was told has a question. So why don't you go and throw it out there?
Okay, hi, Tony.
Hi.
I have many questions in my mind, but the first one I wanted to ask you is concerning Lincoln and the American system.
Yes.
And then when McKinley came into office, and I remember looking at different people online discussing, gold standards and silver and all of this, and I want to know if you could actually make it a bit clearer for people, because I know it's something that's always coming back. When there's crisis, people are always talking about, oh, it's time to buy gold or whatever, silver or land or whatever. And,
Right.
This is not going to stop society from collapsing. So you can buy as much gold as you want, but it's, in the end, it's not going to help anybody.
Isn't it?
How does the American system, prevail in this situation? Thanks.
I think today it would be Bitcoins, right? Or
Yeah.
or something new to replace that. That is all the rage instead of gold. Gold isn't as popular as it was, probably. Although I think maybe other countries are building up a big gold supply. But in the period of the American Civil War and going into the 1870s, there was a growing struggle with the power of the international financiers centered around the Privy Council and City of London, extended more and more into Wall Street. Not only Wall Street, but into other locations later on out into the American Midwest, Chicago, first in Cleveland where Rockefeller was, and then his brother was on Wall Street. And these people had the program of restricting credit, restricting available credit, so as to concentrate the power over investment into the hands of those who controlled credit, who had capital. Didn't mean that they had gold, but if you say that gold, they could easily get gold, but they had the capital, and their motive was to stop the influence of the United States as seen the way I've been depicting it. The United States had to be stopped. They could have another United States. You know, the United States of Dick Cheney, the United States of, what's her name? Susan Rice, and so forth. The United States of, I don't know, Harry Truman with the atomic bomb. I don't know, all these things. So these guys said, let us only allow gold and silver, some of them said just gold, to be lawful currency. And if you have a bond on the government, you should be able to get paid it in gold, even though it wasn't arranged that way to begin with. So there was a fight, and Henry Carey, the son of Matthew Carey, Lincoln's advisor, and I go through his role with Lincoln in terms of the facts of that role in the book. Henry Carey and other people in his way of thinking said we need to fight for the right of our nation to issue credit, to have money notes issued, and to have control over banking, control over credit for the purpose of development. This was a fight about the greenbacks. At the same time as they were promoting industrial progress, other people in Carey's immediate circle were sponsoring Thomas Edison at that time to build the first power plants, to invent the electric light and invent public electric power. That was a project of this faction with Edison as the champion. By the time McKinley was president, which is what, in 1897, he came into the White House. Lincoln was assassinated in 65. By the time McKinley was president, the party, the Republican Party that put him up, was pretty thoroughly rotten, controlled by this faction of J.P. Morgan and Rockefeller and these other characters, and they were Anglophiles, like most of them anyway. There were others who still had a Lincoln tradition, but the great steel mills and electricity had been built. It had been started anyway. Electricity wasn't even allowed by the utilities owners to go out to the people. But what you had with McKinley was, at that period, and Teddy Roosevelt came into power by the assassination of McKinley directly. They had, what he was trying to do was to continue industrial progress in all of the Americas, working with Latin America. But the discussion in the public sphere was dominated by imperial influenced universities and other kinds of culture. And the legacy of the industry builders, the legacy of the progressive industrial development was forgotten in the public discussion. It wasn't forgotten by the people who knew about it, but it wasn't there. So the discussion of money, again, as divorced from what was the immediate past history of the economy at that time, and what was the need and the fight going on all over the world, in Ireland, in India, in other countries, in South America, in Asia, in China, who desperately needed to do the same thing America did and build factories, build steel mills, build electric plants, build cities, modern times. That wasn't in the discussion. It was limited when it was controlled by the enemy to a discussion only of money. Fatal.
Mm-hmm. I have a question from Nick. There's a growing list of people who are messaging me. So I've got Nick, then Stephen, Dave, Aaron, Joan, Betty, and Scott. So Nick, go for it.
Hey, Anton. Thanks so much for your class today. Thanks for your book. I purchased it for Christmas. I can't wait to get cracking on it. I wanted to talk to you about, you mentioned before your ideas on the image of man. And it's something for me that I think is... Sorry, do you hear me?
It's hard to hear you.
Right. Yeah, before you were talking about you mentioned about the image of man and how it's something fundamental to an individual or a nation's growth. And it's kind of a contradiction in and of itself, because what you see in history, as you well know, is that when you study civilizations, they do, if they're coming from a place of poverty or just general suffering, they'll have a very sensual need to elevate their physical circumstances. So like, it's something I was drawing on a few weeks back, like when Americans arrived in America, there was very little industrialization, there's very little development. So it was easy centrally for those people to exercise their ideas on a free space of land. But for Europeans at the time, it seemed to be a much harder goal to achieve because of the surroundings and the environment that they were placed in was already so maxed out with oligarchism and elitism, and also the structure of everything, the institutions was already so foundational that it was very hard for them to see the space that they could exercise a new image of man. So I'm now going to take that to like China today. Like I wanted to ask you, like, because there seems to be this issue that when a nation achieves a certain kind of freedom from want, there's this sensual complacency that overcomes us. And I think we all understand that individually as well. Like once you reach a certain point of wealth in life, no matter how poor you were before, anybody who's come from a working class will know that you forget quite easily, people forget quite easily their roots or the sufferings of the past. So how does one overcome that kind of contradiction that you know what are the right things to do, you know that progress is essential for the betterment of each and every one of us and the nation as a whole, but once we've achieved a certain kind of freedom of wanting, and there becomes this kind of complacency, like, oh, I'm fine, I can feed my children, I go to work and I do my life. And it seems to, with each civilization through history, they seem to reach this point where it's so easy for the populace to lose sight of what is the purpose of man. And as you've just been talking about it, when it becomes money or monetary policy in economics, which you could argue is not really economic at all, it's just money printing, that's not economy, that's the same as
I missed a few of the words that you said, so I want you to clarify what it is in China that you're talking about with this more complacent attitude. Are you talking
what I'm saying is
about the people who have cell phones?
No, yeah. Well, I don't know if people here watch a lot of China or their media and stuff, but like even in you do start to see, like, in the younger populations, there's this kind of commercial attitude that kind of takes place, and this popular opinion. I think it's more popular opinion that starts to like infiltrate their minds, and they become, fashion is a way of doing that, how it kind of places a social expectation of how people should dress, how you should behave, how you should conduct yourself in day-to-day affairs. So I guess the ability for a nation not to fall into this trap of complacency after having a period enormous success like China's going through the past 40 years and is just coming back from the moon this week. America did all these things 40 years ago. So is China going to have the same problem? Probably likely that they are, because it seems to be a human conditional problem, like a kind of contradiction of ourselves. And how do we overcome that? I think it lies in what you were saying earlier about the image of man and how we see man and his ability to produce good like things and objects for the greater good on this planet, or if you're just doing it for the sake
Okay,
of it.
now I want to answer this because you've raised really what amounts to the central problem in the world that confronts the entire world. It's a problem within the United States, and it's a problem among the countries and within the countries. It applies to the situation between, say, Israel and the Palestinians. It applies to India versus China. It applies to a lot of things. It certainly applies to the problem of culture and the slave issue for culture of young people in the world who are in social media or opinion or whatever. I would say that the first issue on a sensual level is what I brought up about Afghanistan. The US congressman who says let's have more war there doesn't see Afghanistan in his mind. Those are not his neighbor. Love thy neighbor? What neighbor? I don't have any neighbors. I live alone, or my country lives alone, or I live in a gated mansion, whatever it is. He doesn't see his neighbor. Any child or young adult who is wedded to the decadent postmodernist culture. Postmodern means feudal, by the way. That's the definition of it, right? It's not modern. Modern is electricity and space program. So any child that is in that doesn't have an operative compassion for other people, doesn't have any sense. They don't even have romantic attachments to other people in many cases, right? So what is the problem? How do you deal with this? Start with the history. How did we solve this problem in the past? Well, there were certain people, certain individuals, certain teams of individuals, as in this book, that took it upon themselves to do what was necessary because they had certain gifts of heritage or other gifts, right? In other words, what if the United States remains in the disaster of the post-Kennedy era, the coup d'etat that was the murder of John Kennedy, that put a murder demonstrably committed by fascists? What if we remain in that era, which has different features at different times, but really that you're talking about the deficit? Then what would happen to China? What would happen to the nuclear weapons that are stored by all the great powers? What do you think is going to happen with that? I don't think it's going to have a good ending. I don't think that, and in fact, I would bet that the destruction of civilization would be not by nuclear war, but by a quick devolution in a lot of ways. Right. So what is the issue? What do you have to think about? The United States, to rescue itself from its very frightening situation. The people in America are frightened. Across the board, people are frightened by by facts, by polarization, by fear of the future, and so forth. So in order to, the United States has to do something differently, and other countries have to do something differently as well. Supposing that there is a partial breakthrough, which is the way you would obviously have to hope for. The world is not going to all change at once. But supposing that there's an initiative somehow between, say, some of the US or the US and some other countries, or some other countries working together, but inviting the US in and so forth. An initiative to think about what Kennedy wanted to do in the Middle East. He proposed, you read my article about Kennedy versus the Empire. His program was that they build nuclear power plants throughout the Middle East that would be, and they would have the cycle, the nuclear cycle, so you use the waste for refueling. And that these would be geared towards desalination. The United Nations, the International Atomic Energy Agency, what's the word, letters for that? Was changed by Kennedy for at least temporarily, with a committee structure that was for that purpose. The United States and Russia, Israel and the Arabs, Egypt and other countries, US and Mexico, all to build nuclear powered desalination plants, and that these would be joint projects between enemy countries, so-called enemy countries, because no country is the enemy of another by nature. We do have enemies, but they're crazy people, right? Right? Isn't that the truth? We have enemies who are crazy from one standpoint or another, but it's not a nation. It's not a country. So if you had that kind of joint building project, then obviously there'd be other things too. The space program, he wanted to have the US and Russia join together to do the first moon landing. That was supposed to be a joint project. But supposing you had that type of initiative as a new initiative for solving some deadly problems. And the intent is clear just from that action. The state of mind of somebody involved is clear to the public. It represents something that is the genie coming out of the bottle and you can't put it back. The public sees that.
Yeah.
What if the people in Iran saw that? And so forth, right? What if the people in Israel saw that? Crazy people, by and large. People, right? So what would be the reaction of the young people in China to the world catching up to the intention of the Silk Road and the Belt and Road? Right. The world catching up to the potential of space travel. China is not going before the mankind and saying our destiny is to explore the universe because that's what man is all about. They're not saying that. They're just doing these things that are good.
Yeah.
But they don't have the confidence to tell the United States and the rest of the world what they ought to know about the past and future of mankind. And there's things about the past of mankind that China doesn't know about. They obviously know a lot about it because they've been around longer than the other people. But there are some things about Western progress that the West and China don't know. So the question is, what must we do? We who know anything. That's the question, not what will happen if the kids are jerks. What
I
would
would just say,
if they're limited, right? If you're a teacher, you see a jerk and then or a brat, and then you see the transformation of that person into just a miracle of a mature and caring person and a genius, possibly.
Like a Helen Keller.
Yeah, there you go. right. It's exciting, right? Everything.
Some artistic ne'er-do-well.
You have to base all this on excitement. You got to make people excited because you show them what's possible, right? By doing the progress, and at least in some way getting them to understand how it was done in the past. That is the only way it's been done. Look at what we've accomplished. Right now, civilization is not in good repute for good and bad reasons.
Mm-hmm. Anton, I have Warren. I just saw that you raised your hand, so you're on the list. Don't worry, I won't forget about you. Dave is going to have a question next, but I, based on what was just said, I just had one little thought. I personally wanted to contribute because I've had a lot of chances this week to speak at various platforms on why China is not the enemy. And it's really British intelligence that people need to understand. And the thing that I noticed across the board is almost everybody who participated in these various discussions did not know that Sun Yat-sen, the founding father of the Republic of China, was a Christian himself on the one hand, and was a follower of Abraham Lincoln, who studied American system economics and fought to bring that and use that as the basis for the overthrow of the dynastic system. That was not known by anybody who I spoke to, and it's a big mind blower. And when you start looking at Sun Yat-sen as well, and his vision for the international development of China, modeled explicitly on the American experience of industrial development, protectionism, Hamilton he cites, it's really inspiring to see what is actually being awakened in the form of the Belt and Road, and China currently, which really both Taiwan and mainland China are both sort of celebrating Sun Yat-sen. He's really an untouchable. It's quite a phenomenon. But this is really being celebrated and invoked right now. So that's just something I wanted to throw in there. And if you want to say something about that, you can do that. Otherwise, I'll call in Dave.
Go ahead. Keep going. That was good.
Dave, go for it.
Hey, Anton. Thank you for the talk. I've been doing a lot of meditating on, this general idea of outreach as well. And I'm hearing everything you're saying. It's crucial, that history. And I've been doing a lot of surveying online. I like to see what's going on, what different outlets are talking about. And I'm hearing the story that you're telling, the history that you're laying out. And one of the things that really comes to mind is that when we're talking about the audience, there are all these different audiences out there, and they all have different axioms. There's a lot of these, for example, I find it fascinating. There's a lot of these conservative groups that are rising up that recognize, there's this sort of fascist takeover, and they're becoming more sort of pronounced, and they're becoming bolder in their attacks, because they're seeing that, there really is this sort of fascist surveillance state being set up, and it's coming for them. So people are getting a bit more, they're starting to take it a bit more seriously, but they also have these axioms. I was looking at, there's the Claremont Review of Books. That's an interesting one. The Imaginative Conservative, interesting. They have an appreciation for classical culture. I've been looking at PragerU University. They have solid material, and they're good at polemics. But this question of, for example, the oligarchy, this is what they really don't get, that there's something playing all sides, right? There's a Shakespearean sort of Iago, whispering in everybody's ear, and these people don't really get that. And so when you're talking about the role of government and I can hear all these guys, right? They're gonna buck as soon as they hear this idea of government and credit and national bank. But why are they bucking really is that they don't get that higher meta system that you've talked about, that is sort of that is targeting them specifically, and they don't even realize it, and it's flooding the field, right? That's what they do. They flood the field with all sorts of different axioms for different groups. So even some of the better ones still have these beliefs that blind them, but I don't think so. I think the challenge is it has to be personalized depending on who is being approached. My question to you is how are you going to approach this question of the oligarchy, for example, which is really, playing all sides, flooding the field, and they're being victimized by some of the false narratives as well, even though they're very good in certain respects. Tucker Carlson's pretty interesting guy. He's very anti-China, but Glenn Greenwald, there's all these types of people, and they all have different them. So how are you going to deal with them? We have to sort of.
So let's start off by making what you said general, including for yourself and your friends.
Mhm.
And what I mean by that is, if one has in one's mind, in one's mental map, in the illustrations, let's say, for thinking, the oligarchy as the enemy, and that's it,
No,
you're lost.
Of course, yeah.
Because you have to start at the other end, and then you see what these guys are, what they're opposed to. You have to start. I mean, like when we used to organize and ran into police problems influenced by the FBI, we would have published cartoons and about the FBI, making fun of them as inept and silly, as well as doing things that are indecent. But it was a lot of humor there. But we were starting with the other side. So let's take up what you said about, you mentioned the Claremont Review. I take it that that's related to Claremont College out in Southern California, which is a noted center for the Straussians. Are you familiar with Strauss? This is a form of conservatism that we identified back when we published this pamphlet called, what was it? It's about Dick Cheney, as sort of the son of the devil, right?
The children of Satan.
Yeah, children of Satan. There you go. And so they derive from this this guy who is promoting their own version of classical culture, which does not begin with the universal idea of the good. They even make themselves out as experts on Plato. So this is your classic Delphic presentation. What I would say is that you have people from various backgrounds of knowledge, from various perspectives, from various, they're in various kinds of traps of thinking, or they know certain things that are valuable. They want certain things that are valuable. But how do you get everybody or a large number of people to act? Well, you have to activate the minds of some to begin with. And I don't mean one person at a time. I'm talking about doing things, a certain aspect of the general culture, even in some areas that might have an effect. But it has to be above simply getting people one at a time. So certain institutions, certain classes of teachers or influencers or whatever, you have to take some leaps with doing some work that will get something going that upsets the apple cart, so that it's asymmetrical warfare in a sense. I would like to give an example of the kind of reference that the general public ought to know about, or a large proportion of people ought to know, and that is Franklin Roosevelt's speech 80 years ago, this coming January 6th, called the Four Freedoms speech. It was his State of the Union address, his message to Congress, annual message to Congress. In 1941, the war The Second World War was on, but the US wasn't yet in it. And Franklin Roosevelt spoke of the need for the United States to help defend the people under attack by Hitler and Mussolini in Japan. And so that we should supply them people to defend themselves with weapons. These are sovereign countries that are under attack. And in that speech, he's talking about the world that we are fighting for. What is that world all about? And the general idea there is, what is the world that we're going to have after this war is won? And at the end of this speech, he spoke of the 4 freedoms. And I want to show you how that's connected to what I've talked about earlier. And the 4 freedoms are freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. Now remember that Franklin Roosevelt is a superior strategist of practical world affairs. He's a supreme politician. And this was what he had in mind. We make of that have to be jibing together. Let's think about those things that he mentioned, those 4 freedoms in today's world. Freedom of speech. The Chinese young people that were mentioned, staring at their phone or looking at themselves in the mirror with the new fashion. It's actually better than the kid in America who doesn't even think about a new fashion, maybe just staring at the phone. I don't know. But that child, or the American child, or the Canadian child who's in that, doesn't speak. Do their parents speak? Do their grandparents, who might have been boomers, do they speak? And by speaking, I mean actual speech, real speech, important speech, speech about their future. No, their future and their neighbors. What's going to happen to them? What's going to happen to themselves, just themselves, let alone mankind? They're not allowed to do that. And it's not just censorship by big tech or by government. They just don't speak. They're afraid, or they don't know enough, or things. So we do not have freedom of speech right now. It's gone. Doesn't mean it could not be awakened and gotten. In fact, it's a very unstable situation for our enemies, because the internet and other things are capable of being, in their view, misused by Putin, or by Tarian, or by any other bad actor, right? Or by Chaitkin, right? Anybody. So, freedom of speech. What about somebody in India, or and somebody in Pakistan? Are they free? First of all, to speak? There's a lot of problems there, right? They might get killed if they speak the truth about their situation vis-a-vis the enemy ethnic or group. Are they free to practice their religion without fear? No. What's the fear? You might have terrorism, but more directly is the fact that people, maybe that's not a good example because they're not in actual war most of the time, But Jews and Muslims right around them, say Palestinians, do not have freedom of religion. They don't have respect for the other religion, and they really don't have respect. The Jews don't have respect for their own religion in Israel. But people are not free to practice their religion, because religion is also the reality of religion is tradition, is culture, and so forth, as well as high philosophy. And that involves tenderness and things, qualities which you can't have in the situation now. Freedom from want. That's the most obvious. That got me in trouble when I talked about that in an interview recently. Franklin Roosevelt said that's a universal right of mankind. And that got written into the United Nations Charter, Article 23 of the Declaration of Human Rights. And the whole charter of the UN is based on the 4 freedoms of Franklin Roosevelt. Doesn't mean that's what the UN does, but that's the basis of it. That was agreed to by the world. It's based on his idea, and his idea about what America's role ought to be to help guarantee that with Russia, China, and Britain. He was for good American-British relations, just the same way Franklin was. Not the British Empire, but Britain as a country. But the freedom from want is obvious. If that's human rights, how do you get the freedom from poverty, the freedom from this desperate material circumstance? How do you improve material circumstances? By doing what, maybe now you say by doing what China's doing, they got people out of poverty, but by doing, if in America's case, the American system, and later Franklin Roosevelt and John Kennedy, and they were paying direct attention to raising people's living standards. That's all the way through. I got in trouble for bringing that up on this interview recently. There were 2 comments that were sent in saying that I was peddling soft communism.
Which interview was it, by the way?
That was the, I think it was the second
SGT.
SGT. And that because Franklin Roosevelt, and the guy says, I am supposed to pay for some guy who doesn't want to work? Yeah, swine, right? He does not, he's no image of the actual people that are under discussion, that are in desperate need. He has a welfare queen in his mind, right? It's just a swine. So freedom from want is a human right. And then freedom from fear, that's pretty obvious too. The most obvious is you can't have these wars. You can't start a war. And the other thing that came out of Franklin Roosevelt's initiative as president was the actions that Matt has so ably described in his article about Robert Jackson, the chief prosecutor at Nuremberg, who said that the Nazis were primarily guilty, first and foremost guilty of starting World War II. That's illegal. You can't start a war. It's illegal by international law. It's open and shut case. It's not an opinion. The treaties specify that. It's direct international law that starting a war is illegal. If you defend yourself from attack, that's not illegal. But you have to be able to prove that, because war, aggressive war, is a crime. All of the other atrocities of the Nazis were, in the main, or at least many of them, were committed under the cover of that war and to support the war as well, but mainly under the pretext of the war. So if you say that people have as their human rights to be free of fear, you have to stop the wars, call them off. Now go back again to what I'm talking about, Franklin Roosevelt's speech. he was defining what the Allies were fighting for in World War II. Does anybody care about that? People claim to. They often invoke Hitler in discussing things. George Bush did that. Barack Obama did that. George Bush Sr. did that in saying he's bombing Panama to stop Noriega from being a new Hitler. Pretty pathetic. But the actual guy on the American side, along with Stalin and other people who organized the war against Hitler, defined what we were fighting for. That was the American idea. John Kennedy had a similar idea about the world, about the right of people to have development. He built this great dam in Ghana with Kwame Nkrumah. It was Nkrumah's project. The US backed it. The two of them together did it. So they had the right to freedom from want, electricity, and they had the right to freedom from the fear of all these conflicts between nations. It was supposed to electrify all of West Africa. That's America's point of view. If you say that being generous and helping development to stop want and fear are communism, you're just an ignorant slob. You don't know what you're talking about. It's not an opinion. If you say that these people that had these opinions were just individuals, tell me who else represents America. What did they do to build America instead of sell it out? You have to go to the history. So from that standpoint, everybody claims to like the war against Hitler. Well, these were the objectives. Are you with those objectives or are you for Hitler? Hitler did not agree with any of those objectives. He didn't believe in freedom of religion. He didn't believe in, what was the other one? Freedom of speech, right? And so forth.
Just very quick before I go on to the next question, on that same note, the perversion of that argument, we see it now with people like George Soros, Lord Malik Brown, who are saying that responsibility to protect is needed to supersede nation states because we want to stop new Hitlers from arising and committing genocide in their local countries, whether it's in Sudan or Libya or Syria. It's a complete travesty of the actual image of Robert Jackson and FDR and Wallace. So,
and also Soros being on record for helping the Nazis.
Oh, and also, yeah, Cynthia just pointed out Soros being on record himself for helping the Nazis and saying that was the best part of his life. That's another story.
I think that's get into that.
Yeah.
You could the corruption of individuals that are your opponents, and I think that's a bad road to go down.
Yeah, I've got
personalities. It's I don't care what they did. I mean, it's not good.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway,
I've got 6
right.
people on this list, so just so you know that there's 6 questions that are waiting to come at you.
I won't talk so much.
No, that's great. No, develop your ideas, but I'm just letting you know. So Stephen, I skipped over you accidentally. Go for it.
No worries. Thanks, Matt. Thank you, Anton. Enjoying this tremendously, and a number of the points you've brought up and elements that other questions have brought up really bring to mind Lash's The Culture of Narcissism, because a lot of them seem to describe narcissistic traits or behaviors. Have you considered your sort of general thesis here from the context of Lash and the narcissistic culture? Or is anyone else exploring that in your field that you know of today? Because I have an interest in that kind of part of the field or that perspective.
I haven't read that book. Is that Joseph Lash?
No, it's Christopher Lash.
Okay.
1979, The Culture of Narcissism.
Well, I think that if I understand what it's about, I think that is a very good thing to think about. If you think about what is the susceptibility of the lower class, by lower I mean not the upper, and to be manipulated because of narcissism. And if you think about the state of mind of the oligarchy, like Don Giovanni, right? They're fools. They can't take it with them. They maintain a certain life that they see nothing beyond that, except they might see the continuation of that somehow in the future. You see the movie Dr. Strangelove, and the guy played by Peter Sellers in the wheelchair, some combination of, I don't know, it's supposed to be Henry Kissinger's accent or something, but he's saying when the bombs drop, the H bombs, we will be down in the bunker with virgins, right? Not very intelligent, right? It's narcissism, right? His genitals are the center of the universe. That's really not the center of the universe. That's not a heliotropic viewpoint. So narcissism is real, and it's a feature of the kind of blocking of creativity that we used to talk about. Matt, what was the guy who wrote that book about that?
Christopher Lash. Oh, sorry, you're talking a different book.
No, your book. I'm talking about this earlier thing about how creativity is blocked.
Oh, Lawrence Kuby. The creative.
Is that maybe that's who it was?
Yeah, the neurotic distortion of the creative process. Is that it?
Yeah, that's it.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess what would be good is if you could write up a review of that book and say how that connects to the general problem that we're facing. That would be good.
Oh, good. I've got a little homework for me. Thanks.
Yeah.
All right. So next up we have Aaron Kelfin here in Montreal.
First of all, I want to say thank you very much. I thought that this was, I definitely have to buy your book and read through it.
Only $9.99 on Kindle.
Okay. I probably had a question earlier on, but I think at this point, it's turned kind of more into a comment, but I'd like to frame it first before I go into it. So I met Matt about 6 years ago, and this would be the first time that I was introduced to this other side of history, let's say, right? The kind of what's been going on parallel to what I was being taught in school and what I'm still being taught now in my second to last year of university. And so recently I had the opportunity for one of my classes to start working on a report, which I intend to continue as my master's thesis. And the report that I'm working on right now is the first part is framing what I've come to discover as the American system, as you've described it. I had the opportunity to read through Carey's Harmony of Interest, and as well as looking at the reports of Hamilton's report on public credit and national banking. And so just again, to frame all this, I'm 24, I'm in university. None of this is necessarily part of the conversation. We do, at least in the program that I'm taking a public policy major with a liberal arts minor. And in that liberal arts minor, I had the opportunity to read through Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. I had the opportunity to read through Marx on Capital. But we do read through the Federalist Papers, but that was an elective course I was able to take. It wasn't something that was mandatory. But anything else essentially on the American development of these conceptions of economic ideas, national ideas, governmental ideas, we don't really go through. Obviously, my theory is because I'm
Quick question. Are you in Quebec?
Yes, I am.
Okay, I'm going to bring that up.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Obviously,
So that's what I was just about to say. Is I'm sure it's because I am in the colonies. So
Well, no, I have something more specific about Quebec. Well, go ahead, keep going.
So essentially, to my comment, there's something that both Nick and Dave brought up earlier, and it brought to mind two things. First of all, it brought to mind Shelley's principle of the poetic, the poetic principle, right? And essentially, in framing what you're doing, so what you're doing is you're presenting an old idea. It's not a new idea, but I think what is missing right now for, let's say, people in my position, young people, is making that old idea novel, making it new, right? Allowing for us to engage with that idea in the here and now, and actually see how that could affect here and now. And at least among my own peers and my friends and people that I'm very close with, other than Matt and everybody who's here right now. To your point earlier about are you actually talking? Are you speaking about these things? These conversations aren't really happening. And more often than not, when you try to bring up the conversation, you're kind of treated like you're trying to be antagonistic or disruptive. So yeah, maybe to all my comments, you could expand from there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Now, I have an there's a book about economics by Robert Samuelson, and it has a family tree of economics, and it has Karl Marx and it has Adam Smith, but it has this crazy timeline, and it ends up with the British economics and communism, and that's it. There is no other thing there. Sorry, it's this crazy thing. So now the advantage that you have in a college is that you can easily do things to upset the course of affairs. You don't have to scream and have a riot or burn anything. It's very easy to very quietly, or at least in terms of the level of noise, upset things. Who is the founder of Quebec?
What's his name? Well, modern Quebec.
You mean when? Like
who is
Samuel
the
de
founder of Quebec? You come up with some answers.
Cartier.
I'll tell you my answer. You start. Who do you think I have in mind?
Levesque.
From the standpoint of what I've been talking about.
Columbus.
What's that?
Franklin. Albert.
How about Colbert?
Colbert.
Yeah.
Colbert.
Isn't he really the founder of Quebec?
Not as far as I was educated on.
Well, what is his relationship to the settlement of Canada?
He started it.
Yeah, he started the settlement. In other words, there were other people who came here, but what was the intention? Some people were doing adventures, some people were doing whatever, but there was another intention among the rulers in Europe or among the wealthy or whatever to have trading with the natives and to play various kinds of games, both with them and against them, and also against other countries, instead of building up civilization. So he said, let's settle this area and bring civilization in, improve things. By the way, the people who want to do that and are serious about it always want to do the right thing with the natives. The people who don't, this is where the subject, there's a rotten discussion about this, about the history of the treatment of the indigenous people. But leave that for the moment. The founder of Quebec as a European project, as a settlement, not just say some foreign country conquered some territory. That's not, what did you set up? India was conquered by England, but they didn't settle India, right? They didn't make it into a new England, did they? They just raped it and looted it and set people against each other to kill each other. So Colbert, who was desperately trying to get the King of France to be not a barbarian and a narcissist, that was the chief problem with the king, Louis XIV, right? He was an idiot, a narcissist. So he wanted him to live in the Louvre because it was a science place. So anyway, he sponsored Leibniz, and that's it. So this guy who believed that the government should direct the progress of industry and protect industry and develop science and also protect the freedom and dignity of man, right? That's his idea. Made great accomplishments in France, but also founded Quebec. Now, how can you have a discussion, an honest discussion? The word honest comes in here. That's the key thing. Can you have an honest discussion in Quebec, of all places in the world, about economics if you leave out the most famous French economist ever, who was the founder of the place you're studying it? How is that an honest discussion? And I in chapter, chapters 2 through 5, I think, I go through in this book how Lord Shelburne developed this whole attack on France and on other countries based on trying to wipe out the influence and legacy of Colbert. Simple as that. Hamilton invokes Colbert in his report on manufacturers. That's the model. There's other models too, earlier kings and queens, and Renaissance and things like that, and other countries too were models. That China was a model, and then Franklin, ancient China, and some things left over from ancient times. But there's the honesty, the question of honesty. I believe that the central issue faced by people who don't speak out is that they put up with lying all the time. If they don't lie themselves, they will usually lie, but lying is the mode of life, especially about public affairs, and it often is about personal affairs. But here you have a direct lie. It's obvious, it's sophistry. How can you have an honest discussion when you're deliberately avoiding the most famous economist of France, against whom all of this modern bullshit is directed? Adam Smith. You can't say Karl Marx is directed against Colbert. Anyway, so that's what I would recommend.
Yeah, I've got one thought on that. Anton, I might call upon you to maybe give a class in the new year on some of this pre-American Revolutionary period. Especially what I've been very curious about is the cameralist school of Louis XI, Henry VII, and how that evolved into Colbert and what he was doing after Mazarin. That might be a really juicy topic that I haven't seen really treated thoroughly yet.
There's a good biography of Louis XI that I would recommend. And amazingly, it was sponsored by the Rockefeller Foundation. That is, the guy who wrote it was sponsored by the Rockefeller Foundation. And when he wrote the thing, they withdrew their support. But it's a very good biography. You can look it up.
Interesting.
Anyway.
Okay, cool.
Go ahead.
So we got Joe and Betty.
What was the name of that biography?
Hold on.
Oh yeah, I just, as a disclaimer, I just said I haven't seen that topic treated thoroughly. I'd say the person who has treated the most thoroughly that I have seen thus far has been Sam Lebriere, who just spoke, who delivered a wonderful class a couple of months back that people can check out on the Rising Tide site on Colbert, Leibniz, And what's
Yeah,
the
but
other?
actually, a lot of my stuff on Colbert was based on the work of Anton.
Okay, all right, cool.
I have to step out, so I just want to say thank you very much, everybody, and I hope that everything else goes well.
Thank you for coming on, Aaron. So Joe and Betty, or Anton, did you have something else you wanted to throw out there? Okay, Joe and Betty, you're up.
Hello, Tony. Remember me? Tony. Joe Jennings. Hi.
Hi.
Hi, how are you? So one
Good.
point,
Where are
you're
you?
Houston.
Okay.
So first of all, on the whole Afghanistan and Rand Paul and the troop pullout, and you said there's some of these people have no compassion for the people in Afghanistan, and that's why they don't think about. Well, actually, you may wish to know that the person that introduced that amendment to the Defense Act was not a man, but a woman, but more likely a viper by the name of Lynn Cheney. Okay, so in her case,
that's serious.
yeah. So in her case, it's not just a question of lack of compassion. Okay.
Oh boy, how come he didn't say that in that article?
I don't know, but it's there. But I'm going to ask you a question about Rand Paul's father. Okay, so
yeah,
I met twice with Ron Paul down here, you know, who had put himself forward as a great scholar, you know, anti-Federal Reserve and so forth, right? And I fought it out with him, and for the life of me, I couldn't get through his thick skull the difference between the Federal Reserve and Alexander Hamilton's National Bank. He kept saying, I'm not a Hamiltonian, I'm a Jeffersonian, right? So, so why is that such a difficult concept for people to fathom? Okay. I have two other quick questions. You don't have to answer them now, you know. To some extent, did Henry Clay? What? Well, no, let's put them out quick and just a second.
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I'll skip the second one, but Abraham Lincoln's greenbacks. Okay. So, you know, Lincoln introduced the greenback, which was you know, abundant, you know, deployment of currency into the, you know, the northern states, right? Not backed by gold, but it somehow functioned as a stimulus. I wonder, you know, how is it that just the introduction of the currency at that point, you know, and severing from the gold, could be, you know, was ensured to go in productive directions, as opposed to say, you know, say a Keynesian policy, which was also based on just printing money, but not productive. Okay, how was it that the greenback policy was, you know, shaped or directed toward a productive outcome at that moment, you know, and certainly the Civil War? So that I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
The second question is easy. The greenbacks were issued just to have an ample money supply to carry out the program of the country. You needed money to carry on the war, and you needed money to expand the manufacturing and the supplying of the war, as well as to build up the country's power. So you have to have an ample money supply to do it. It's very simple. The enemy wanted to constrict the money supply. They also wanted to tax manufacturing. The bankers in New York said to Lincoln, we'll back your war bonds if you put a tax on manufacturing. Ridiculous, right? You don't want to, that would constrict the whole operation. So the issue was the program. The issue wasn't the money. The money was, if you could choke off the money supply, it's like choking off the blood. A person is not his blood, right? That's ridiculous, right? It's just blood. It's just like what circulates, that's all. That's not the soul. It doesn't, by itself, it doesn't ensure anything, right? You could issue a lot of money, like has recently happened. Wasn't that called QE2 or something? Queen Elizabeth II or QE4 or something, right? So it doesn't do anything. Going to the first thing, very important issue about Ron Paul. Ron Paul had some aides in Congress who were very good people. And it's often the case that very good people will attach themselves to those who have some mistakes in the way they're doing things, or even to people that are 3/4 bad, as long as there's anything good about them. I think Ron Paul was generally a well-intentioned person. He is a follower of the Austrian School of Economics. Von Mises, there's a von Mises Institute in Alabama for the reason that it's a Confederate state, really. Hayek was the other great leader of that school of economics. The origins of this is very concrete. It's not vague if you know about it. It was originated as the British and continental European doctrine that was taught basically as British economics to the Habsburg family by a tutor whose name escapes me at the moment during the 1870s as an attack, a direct attack against Bismarck and Lincoln and their economic ideas of dirigism, Colbertism, the American system. So it was a direct attack on those things at the time. Lincoln and Bismarck were the enemies, both of them. And of course, the American Union and its pretense to advancement against the right of these Confederates to do what they wanted. Their rights were violated by this horrible union. Remember, they sent the Austrians sent Maximilian to their son to Mexico to be the emperor, to oppose the Union side. The second development that really made this into a powerful school of economics was right after World War I. In Austria, Ludwig von Mises was an advisor to a set of politicians in Austria. And these guys were put into office by the League of Nations economic section, Sir Arthur Salter from Cambridge, and his partner, the head of the Bank of England, Montague Norman. The Bank of England and the League of Nations worked together, the economic section of it, to install a fascist government in Austria before Mussolini. It was the first fascist government in Europe. And the advisors to that government, the advisors were Hayek and von Mises. Von Mises was the chief advisor. And the irony, of course, is that they were in favor of a free market, a total free market. The government is not allowed to interfere in favor of the general welfare. But of course, the government is allowed to have private anti-Semitic militia going around enforcing their edicts of cutting the budget and firing all the workers like railroad workers and postal workers and making life miserable. And if you oppose what they're doing, you would be beaten up or killed. That was imposed by the Bank of England and these guys. But with these guys got famous among the oligarchy and professors in different places for playing that role of imposing austerity, like they later did in Chile under the dictator Pinochet. Right? That is the background, the actual background, anti-American background, anti-civilized background of the Austrian School of Economics. Now, having said that, there are many people who go along with that, who are good people and think that they're standing up for freedom. They just don't know the history. They don't, not only the history of the Austrian school, but they don't know what America is. They don't know how nations are established. They don't know anything about history. Their idea of history is just theory. There's nothing. It's a mist. That's the problem.
before calling on
Just
Scott,
just a second,
I
just
had a
second.
quick thought to just add on to that. Is that okay, Joe?
Well, yeah, I just had one other comment, but
Okay,
go
just
ahead.
quick, based on what Anton just said, there's something that I think is fascinating, and I've been sort of piecing together this picture to write and prepare a little video on the debate between Frederick von Hayek and John Maynard Keynes in London, that was orchestrated in the London School of Economics, because it was really at that period in October 1932, right before the American elections that brought in Franklin Delano Roosevelt, that you had the rise of the pro-Abraham Lincoln American system statesmen inside of America who were preparing. I mean, they were all rallying around the person of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and to preempt what the financial oligarchy, the British Empire, is very good at creating these false schisms, these false left-right dualisms, like they did in the French Revolution, right? And then just create a false basis of argumentation, which I think to this very day has confused a lot of people on both sides of the Democratic and the Republican aisles. But it was Time magazine, which at that point had already been hijacked by a few key Rhodes scholars, published this challenge by I think it was Keynes against von Hayek, and then you had these publicized debates, kind of like the Thomas Huxley versus Darwin debates, a little bit earlier, and everyone thought they had to pick a side, and the American system school of political economy was sort of it sort of fell through the wayside. And to this very day, I think even now, most Democrats think they have to be Keynesians, and most Republicans think they have to be Austrian school, and they forget that there's this other tradition. That's all I wanted to throw out there.
Let Joe finish.
Well, I'll say the second time I met with Ron Paul, he was speaking at a forum for legalizing pot. He'd become the champion of the pot legalization movement, which means that he's, the idea of the creative spark of the human mind being the driver for economics was not within his ken, or he would never go for that. But also, I ask you this, there's this book, I think it's called The Road to Serfdom. The Road to Serfdom?
Road to Serfdom, yeah.
That's by what? Von Mises, right?
Hayek.
It's by Hayek. And his contention is that the way you're going to become a serf is through submitting to big government. Is that what he's proposing?
But at the last chapter of that book is worth the price of it if you read that, because he gives the game away. He says in the last chapter that the way to ensure a free market within any country is to have a world police force, a dictatorship over the whole world by a police force, to make sure that no country violates the freedom of the market.
Well, the last thing, and the irony is that, this phenomena that has kind of come and gone called the Tea Parties, right? They came into existence with the crash of the mortgage bubble, and the bailout that was pushed through to save, this impossible pyramid of paper, right? And so in a way, they were revolting against the free market, the revolt, right? But then I went to a couple of their meetings, and they had the word free market enshrined on the wall with gold embossed letters, like this was some pagan god they all had to worship. So that's one of those ironies that, I don't think they ever discovered.
I wouldn't worry too much about that when you're organized. Obviously you didn't, you took them as individuals and as people of good faith. As I pointed out, in Ireland, in the period of just after the American Revolution, they were fighting for what they called free trade. And what they meant by that was to stop Britain's interference with Ireland's right to trade with whoever they wanted to. That's what they meant by it. So dishonest people take that now and say, well, the Irish were fighting for the right of British manufacturers to inundate them with cheap goods, which is
actually
a total lie.
One of the other things the Irish were fighting for was that the English were putting tariffs on goods No, they were saying you had the price of Irish beer, for example, was one of them, had to be much, much higher. They had some kind of customs thing arrangement or some kind of financial penalty so that English brewers were highly favored over native Irish brewers.
Okay, now I want to speak because I discussed that situation in my book. The second chapter is about what happened in Ireland. There was a revolt in Ireland at that time. And the chief objective of that revolt was to protect Irish manufacturers. They're not going to win a fight to take down British tariffs, even though they objected to the British, telling them that they couldn't trade with this, couldn't trade with that, and had to pay a high tariff to trade with England. That's not a free market. The British never believed in free markets. What the Irish were fighting for, the workers were fighting for, and the patriots were fighting for, and the strategists that were for Ireland's future, led in many ways by Matthew Carey in person. And it was based on Franklin's guidance. They were fighting for the protection of Irish manufacturing. The linen workers in particular were starving because of the British strategy, which was guided by Lord Shelburne directly, who gave them a concession. He and his friends gave Ireland a concession to have their own parliament. But it wasn't, that is to have certain, rather put it this way, to make the Irish parliament partly independent, but it was a sham because they always imposed restrictions on what they could do. So there were workers, there was a workers' movement led by Matthew Carey, the Irish Catholic revolutionary, who later was the American protectionist. And at that time, before he fled to Paris to work with Franklin directly, and later on, when he came back there, in particular, after he came back to Ireland, this is 1784, they were fighting for the right, they wanted Parliament to pass a law for tariffs and other means of protecting and promoting directly Irish manufacturing so that they wouldn't starve. And so that this was the freedom that they were contending for. And then the British directed the Chancellor, acting through his men in the Parliament, the Chancellor of Ireland, was directing the Parliament from above, from Britain, to vote down a protective tariff. And this was the central issue on which Matthew Carey was leading the public. Many of the workers were part of the armed volunteers movement. They had over 100,000 armed men in the Irish volunteers. And they weren't threatening anything in Britain. They were simply saying, we're the basis for Irish defense. It was a little bit vague, but it was obvious, right? It wasn't vague at all. They were armed Irishmen. So Carey was arrested, and he was obviously threatened with either life imprisonment or murder, probably just assassination. And he fled then to America and was immediately sponsored by both Lafayette and George Washington to start up as the publisher in Philadelphia, because he had been in their movement, which was operating. Lafayette and Washington and Franklin were operating a movement inside Ireland. They weren't directing it; they were just sponsoring it and helping them and providing inspiration. And Carey was the chief of that. So this question of protection of manufacturing in order to develop this power over nature and raise the people of Ireland out of misery and poverty and out of backwardness, because they didn't have the Industrial Revolution in Ireland. It didn't happen there. Why? They were all stupid. There's a lot of people who talk about cultural this and that. you telling me that Catholic people can't develop manufacturing? Tell that to the Medici. Right? So, and to Colbert. So that is the alternative history. The real story is against this business of so-called free trade. The British had a slogan, free trade, which was for other countries, not for them. They had tariffs on their own country. That's how that was one of the ways they built up their manufacturing. Even that would not have really developed English manufacturing because they had no strategy for it until the Franklin Circle in England, the good Englishmen like Wedgwood and Bolton and Watt, these other people who were anti-slavery and pro-development, who paid good wages, decided to develop England. And the manufacturing that grew up was supported by tariffs that had been in place since Queen Elizabeth. So all the free trade is just a furious lie.
And that story you go through so thoroughly in your book, Anton, and anybody who really wants to really understand and internalize this whole combat by Benjamin Franklin and his Lunar Society that industrialized Manchester and really got England out of the feudal ages. It's such an irony of history, and Anton's book really goes through that. So that's something to look forward to. Oh, Anton, what?
I'm gonna give a plug for the book. All right.
Yeah.
This is an endorsement for this book by the Lunar Society of England, which was reconstituted in Birmingham in recent decades.
No.
It's now headed up by a Black woman. And there's some old gentlemen who are there who are very public-minded doctors and others who believe in the general welfare passionately. They were old guys, older than me. And they said, this is their endorsement, which is on the back cover of the book. The Lunar Society is delighted to welcome the publication and to promote the dissemination of this major work on the development of progressive thought in the United States of America.
That's great.
So I could say that the revived Franklin group has endorsed the book.
That's fascinating.
Can you hold up the cover of the book?
Here's the front cover. Oh, wait a minute. Let me get not a pre-publication. Here. This is the front cover. It shows the Statue of Liberty, Who We Are, America's Fight for Universal Progress from Franklin to Kennedy, Volume 1, 1750s to 1850s. On the back is my picture and some endorsements.
Yeah, I'll in the invite that I sent out to the Zoom meeting, there's a link so that people can purchase the Kindle or the paperback, and I'll make sure that that's there in the description of this video too on YouTube. We got a few more questions, Anton. Yeah, Sean Stone is up there too as an endorsement. So we've got, just so you know, Marty, Scott, Sam, Warren, Lazarus, and then I think we should probably cap it at that point. I feel like we're going through a lot of content here. You're giving people a lot of discoveries. Martin Seif. I can't hear you though, you're on mute. Still on mute. Feel like we're getting closer. I can't unmute him.
You see?
Cynthia believes that I can unmute him. Do I have the power of doing that? Cynthia?
Oh, am I unmuted now?
Perfect.
Thank you, because I can see you, but I don't think you can see me. It's all very complicated.
We can see you and hear you.
Anton, I've admired your work from afar, fitfully over many years. It's a pleasure and a privilege to hear this presentation. There are specific areas where I think I would happily disagree with you on this, that, and the other, but overwhelmingly, I'm astonished by not just how much I agree with you, because as Matt knows, I usually get pleasure in disagreeing with everyone, which is why I am where I am in life, or not. But in so many, there was a book I published in 2012, which had a terrible title imposed on it by a commercial publisher, That Should Still Be Us, which I think is a classic example of how repression can come not even through deliberate conscious intent, but through sheer incompetence and stupidity with so many of the people we have to deal with in life. Because, of course, with a title like that, it went nowhere. And there was a refutation of the entire concept of pure free trade. And you have touched on so many areas I regard as live wires in the most revealing and constructive ways. I, of course, am Irish. And my standards, therefore, my Republican standards of getting Irish history correct are insufferably high. And you, of course, effortlessly passed all of them with a great leap. You, of course, focused on exactly the key area, which is invariably missed far too much by Irish Republicans themselves, which is the economic dimension in the 18th and 19th century. And you have just also brought up something which I bring up in my own books about British history and American history, which is the importance of unconscious hypocrisy and the double standard, this preaching of free trade to the entire world, when first the British and then we rose by practicing precisely the opposite. Now, in 2015, I had to publish myself. I hope it should still be available both from Amazon.com and from my website, a book called Cycles of Change. And before that, in 2012, I did, as I say, a book which was really a refutation of Thomas Friedman's absurdities and of free trade in general, called That Should Still Be Us. Now, that's a title even I can't remember. And I wrote the book. And the title was imposed on it by editors who were idiots, of course. Again, you hit another wonderfully positive. In that book, I found what you found. I knew already that the French Revolution had been directly triggered by the free trade agreement Britain had made with France in its own interest in 1786, and that the French had been stupid enough to swallow. And of course, that comes directly from Adam Smith, who is now a god, as you rightly say, of the Republicans, and of far too many Democrats too. And I'm fascinated by Smith because I take him on in my book and try and demolish him. And therefore, of course, the book got a handful of favorable reviews outside the United States, not a single review, even hostile, within the United States. Was utterly, totally smothered with a degree to which the KGB would have envied at 30 and 40 years ago in the Soviet Union, would have envied the efficient way in which but you know this very well. I mean, for me to say this to you is like a phrase, bringing coals to Manchester. I'm an enormous admirer of Franklin and Franklin's seminal role in all of this. One point I would add, and I apologize, I have not had the chance to read your book yet. You're probably ahead of me again as usual. But in my reading, when Franklin originally goes to Britain, he still regards himself as an Englishman. He thinks reform and the settling of grievances between rational men is still possible. He comes very slowly and very reluctantly to the view that America must break from Britain. Washington, of course, we see the same evolution. But in Franklin's case, a key factor was his travels in Scotland. And I'm not sure if he was able to travel to Ireland. I stand to be corrected by you on that, but he was certainly familiar with conditions there. And Franklin, of course, as a decent colonialist, an enlightened man from a society of infinite variation, infinite possibility, because the resources are so unlimited and the population still so small, is used to a society where the most humble people can live with respect. It's what George Orwell sees in Mark Twain. Orwell says about Twain, and it's an idealism because, of course, we are already talking about a world which is torn apart by the horrors of slavery. But Orwell, who is the non-Marxist English socialist of the very best kind, says you read Twain and you see what human beings are like when they are truly free. when they can be dignity and free of the terror of wage slavery and enormous exploitation. It's an enormously powerful insight, of course, enormously powerful insight. Franklin is in London. And Jefferson, I think, learns from this initially from him, though he takes different consequences from it. But both of them go away with understanding the power of the city of London. They both see it as this enormous octopus, soaking in inconceivable power and wealth. But the price for this, and the brilliant culture that at first Franklin so admired, is the total horror and destitution that he sees in Scotland and in Ireland. And of course, it goes much further afield too. It leads to the impoverishment of India. It leads to the destruction of China in the following century. I don't know if it's still available via Zoom, Matthew with his usual technical wizardry. I would recommend to you, if you missed it before, my presentation to him on what I call the first NATO, the period of 1840 to 1870, when Britain and France exactly, you know this, in the name of human rights and free market above all, free markets as the way to the happiness of the human race, systematically pillage and destabilize and destroy societies all across the world. There are enormous pathologies that come from this. China's century of horror and powerlessness comes from this, from blowing open China so that unlimited British opium imports for enormous profits can be pumped through Hong Kong and Canton into China without limit. What you mentioned, of course, the attempt to enslave Mexico using the Habsburgs and the French as their fall guys, with the brief empire of that idiot Maximilian in the 1860s, comes from this. The British support of the Confederacy, deliberately creating, which would have been impossible without British and French support, the bloodiest civil war that the Western world had ever seen. Our civil war comes directly from this power. And what stops it? What stops it is a geopolitical alliance against it by two people, one of whom is demonized as the arch enemy in British and American history, Otto von Bismarck, and who was, in fact, a great admirer of Lincoln, and his own great ally, who was also Lincoln's greatest protector and admirer in the wider world, Tsar Alexander II of Russia. And of course, this is why Tsar Alexander is hunted down and assassinated by the prototype CIA, which is Kropotkin's anarchist movement, which is protected systematically by Britain, while it is assassinating systematically the leaders of Russia, America, France, Italy, and Spain through the 30-year period of the 19th century. And to this day, the image of Kropotkin, I'll just mention again in passing, that sticks in the West is of that extraordinary, incompetent historian and utter idiot, the late Barbara Tuchman in The Proud Tar, that Kropotkin is this sweet, kindly, smiling, non-violent, gentle saint at the very time when he is being the arch-godfather of anarchist terror around the world. And we can tie him directly, and I have done very closely indeed, to the direct assassinations of William McKinley specifically, and of Tsar Alexander II. So I'm sorry, I'm being disjointed here, but
can I
no, please go ahead.
I think that I have wanted to disrupt the way people get depressed by history. They see tragedy in the development of a culture, in the mistakes of a culture or the mistakes of leadership. And one way to disrupt this is to show a fight going on within the ranks of a nation.
Yes.
Within the West, more broadly. Now, obviously, we are talking about the fight between two sides in the West, the Republican and the imperialist. But within the United States, this is reflected, this higher level struggle is reflected by the two sides who are concerned on the subject of the industrialization of the USA. And the first place that this erupts into open political warfare that immediately decides the destiny of the country is between Hamilton and Jefferson. What happened with Jefferson, the guy who wrote the Declaration of Independence, who drafted that, who called for ending slavery in the new settlements to the west, who was a partner of George Wythe, the Platonist, and a classical music performance partner in his youth. What happened to that man? Well, when he was governor of Virginia during the Revolution, he was never in the army. He fled when the British attacked Virginia, and his reputation was in tatters. And he was threatening to quit politics after the Revolution. And he was advised by the Southern oligarchy in the person of the leader of that oligarchy, Randolph. Not John Randolph, the other Randolph. His first name escapes me. Anyway, I have it in the book. He was told, you can stay in politics. We need you, because how else will we represent Southern interests? In other words, you have a future as a great leader if you agree to represent Southern interests instead of your ideals. And basically, he agreed to that.
That fits.
He went back into Congress, the Continental Congress, and he was studying Adam Smith and British and continental European baloney that went along with free trade, which would be anti-manufacturing stuff, because the whole issue in the South was, let's not develop the USA into an industrial country. If we do, the slave interest, the slave power is demolished. So we have to not have manufacturing. So he began writing a book along these lines, which was later called Notes on Virginia and Notes on the State of Virginia. That was his only book. And he goes to France as ambassador to replace Franklin, American ambassador to France. And there he gets in with the group of British agents, specifically Shelburne's agents, who are liberal, sophisticated agents of the new British Empire. They favor the demolishing of the French economy, as you pointed out, with the Free Trade Treaty of 1786. When Jefferson was the American ambassador, that was happening on his watch. France, the economy was destroyed. The people went hungry in many places by British free trade. And he was lapping it up. He was writing this book. Franklin's chief agent in France, Morellet, then edited and translated Jefferson's book. And that was published back in America, this Notes on Virginia, at the time when the Americans were debating what kind of government and what kind of program they should have in the new republic after the Revolution. And Jefferson's book said, we must not have manufacturing in America because it will just make the workers into slaves. Well, wait a minute. You've got hundreds of slaves yourself. You're an agrarian. What kind of agrarian is that lets other people do the work? That's not an agrarian. It's just an oligarch. You're a liar. And then at the time when the people were coming over to make this British intervention in France to blow up the French Revolution into anarchism, because they started out trying with Lafayette and Bailly trying to make a modern country there, a beautiful country, and it was blown up by British agents. My whole chapter 5 is on how they did that. It's the first documented account of that British intervention. At that point, while they were setting that up, Jefferson received a visitor, Douglas Stewart, who was sent to him directly by Lord Shelburne, directly. Lord Shelburne's secretary wrote to Jefferson, you must take this man and he's going to teach you about economics. He's going to teach you how to think on these traditions, on these questions of statecraft and economics. And he had a month's long conference of being tutored by this guy and met with him day after day. It was his hero. Douglas Stewart was the authorized biographer of Adam Smith and was the teacher of Shelburne's son and of Lord Palmerston himself as a young man. So this is an oligarch, and it was the British intelligence coming out of Bowood House, which is the house of Lord Shelburne. So then Jefferson goes back to America and recruits Madison, who earlier had been a nationalist, and got him to go along with the Southern interest if he knows what's good for him. And they start this war against Hamilton's program in the Congress. A completely dishonest attack against Hamilton, not based on what Hamilton was proposing, but based on lies that Hamilton was a monarchist and that free trade would somehow benefit people. And they knew they knew or should have known that this was a disaster for the United States. They did know that it would make the United States a weak country, and they wanted the United States to be a weak country. And that's a fact. It's demonstrable, and if you want to go against those facts, you have to come up with a different account of what happened. I have the sequence of events.
Yeah.
So somebody has to come up with a different sequence of events, or else they're proven liars about this whole subject of Hamilton versus Jefferson. But if you go into this fight within the USA, which is later the Union versus the Confederacy, this fight within the USA, go when the leaders are the best to look at this. Don't go when you're seeing two sides both sides are crap, like the Democrats and Republicans. Don't get stuck on Donald Trump. Either way, it's not worth it. We're not making deals with China and Russia. We're talking about what is the United States. That has to be made clear. That's the issue. And this is where you have to see this fight inside the USA to understand the history. Otherwise, it's a complete mystery and usually just a lie.
Yeah. Just two things on that. Number one, if people didn't realize it, Marty just brilliantly went through a little bit of a teaser for the class he's going to be delivering next Sunday on one level. On the other level, after just hearing Anton deliver his own thoughts, and especially what I found really masterful in your composition, Anton, I was just flipping through some of the pages, is that you're pulling out these quotes by Jefferson directly from his book, The Notes on the State of Virginia, but you're situating it within the context of your understanding of British color revolutionary tactics in subverting the French revolutionary potential, which could have been great. And so you're able to pull out the different networks and the names and see the connections of who's talking to Jefferson, who's organized or disorganizing him. And the quotes, I mean, just one of them that struck my eye as I was flipping through your chapter here was Jefferson saying, while we have extensive land to work on, let us never wish to see our citizens occupied at a workbench or twirling a distaff. For the general operations of manufacture, let our workshops remain in Europe. It is better to carry provisions and materials to workmen there than to bring them to the provisions and material, and with them their manners and principles. The loss by the transportation of commodities across the Atlantic will be made up in happiness and permanence of government.
Yeah, and like the happy slaves on his plantation.
Yeah, that he argues that the value of slaves doubles every like 20 years. So that's a great new, foundation of the economy. So yeah, really for people, again, plugging your book there, Anton, really thorough quotes, really good. And Martin, for your class, I'm gonna make sure people access your book too, so we can subvert those pesky editors who abused your title and your mission in getting that out. What was it, 7 years ago, 8 years ago?
Believe me, I need all the help I can get, Matt. And thanks to Anton, I am going to try and get a copy to these wonderful people in Birmingham again, who I had no clue whatsoever existed. But if I may make one more point, you come from a philosophical background in your methodology, and that brings you to history. Anton is a master of both philosophy and also historical methodology. And it may be wishful thinking on my part, but I see him as basically having the same basic methodological approach that I do, which is I did not expect to come to philosophy and to grander issues. I was reluctant to do so. But I was forced to do it by the pragmatic conclusions from what I was uncovering. In terms of, I grew up in a depressed economic society in Northern Ireland. I could see how free trade was insanely stupid, how the Cato view, the general post-Reagan American Republican view are simply simplistic and absurd. They do not make sense. So why did people swallow this en masse to such a degree? And of course, eventually this brought me back to David Ricardo and Adam Smith. And then eventually, belatedly, when you look at Smith, you have to look at the answers to Smith. And I was looking at Lincoln and Bismarck independently before I saw them as parts of the same continuum. What is interesting is the brilliant and sinister British economic and political masterminds of that time recognized the threat. There were three great individuals who outplayed them and boxed them in. And Anton's brought this up, you've brought this up, and they are Lincoln, Bismarck, and Tsar Alexander in Russia, especially with his railroad and industrial development program, which is continued under his son. But his son goes off the rails in partly from previous views, because he was always deeply traditionally orthodox, but also I think he's partly driven mad by the horrific way his poor father is murdered. And he unleashes this massive wave of xenophobic anti-Semitism in Russia. And it throws out the baby with the bathwater. They succeed in crushing the nihilist revolutionaries for a couple of generations in the short term. But they also alienate large areas of their intelligentsia and of the Jews, all of whom had strongly supported Tsar Alexander. Tsar Alexander is, apart from a few poisonous intellectuals, it's hard to find anybody who didn't like him. The Jews loved him. The peasants loved him. They regarded the murder of Tsar Alexander as a plot by their own landowners. They didn't know enough to see the British behind it. But nevertheless, in British historiography in particular, you read that Tsar Alexander was a failure, that he was a nice man and well-meaning, but pathetic and ineffectual. And it's a total lie. It's totally the opposite of the truth, just as key elements of Lincoln are suppressed, and just as Bismarck's crucial role in creating humane welfare systems that we have yet to even begin to really effectively bring in the United States. FDR begins it, but nobody tries it after that. Truman, of course, abandons it completely in favor of building up the militaristic superstate. And Eisenhower, who I'm coming to believe is very overrated, basically goes along with Truman's template. Kennedy tries, but we know what happened to Kennedy. But I'm sorry, I'm going on here at length, and it's not my presentation. Anton, again, I just want to thank you for such a masterful presentation. It's an intellectual joy. And, obviously I will be chasing up your book. I wanted to hear the presentation first, so I knew what I was getting into. But this is a hugely, as you know yourself, this is a hugely important achievement that you've carried out. uncovering the real dynamics, not just of American and British history, but of French history too. The one thing I would add to this is I think that Jefferson certainly, and even Franklin, are led by the nose by the British in France, because they think the British liberals want a revolution in France to spread the blessings of liberty that they have.
That's true about Franklin.
Pardon?
I don't think that's really true about Franklin. There's a lot of
go on, please.
Very ambiguous. Franklin was the friend of everybody.
Yes, I agree. Exactly, I agree with you.
Sorry, Benjamin West was the friend of the king of India for the king. So I think you have to be really careful with Franklin. You have to see what he actually did, not who his friends were. His friends were everybody. Everybody. Yes. He was a practice. He did what Jesus would say, right? I mean, you love your neighbor. The neighbor, the oligarchs are the neighbor. He loved everybody. That's fine. But his actions and his influence was not in the way that he is portrayed as the friend of Morellet, for example, Shelburne's agent. Was he a friend of Lord Shelburne? Well, in a sense, he was the friend of Lord Shelburne, but he was the leader of the opposition in the world to what Shelburne was doing, and vice versa. So this is a difficult question.
I agree.
What about Franklin Roosevelt and Churchill? Was Churchill the friend of? Was Franklin Roosevelt the friend of Churchill? Yes, he was.
To a degree.
But he was the greatest enemy of what Churchill stood for in the world. When Franklin was in England for most of 20 years, 1757 to 1775.
Yes.
He was helping build up England. He wanted to improve England.
Yes.
Why not?
Yes,
we want to improve everywhere.
Exactly.
No country is our enemy. England is not the enemy of America. England, in a great sense, is not. Sorry, I'm just in a conference room. Can I call you back? I'm on the phone. Call you back. So Franklin was squelched by the British Empire, but not.
Yes.
England is not. Is England the enemy of Ireland? Well, is Shakespeare the enemy of Ireland?
Exactly.
Shakespeare was what Shakespeare, but Shakespeare, in some sense, you could say, in some instances, you could interpret him as the enemy of France.
Yes.
What is?
Oh, he was very much the enemy of France.
Joan of Arc. But it's ridiculous to say he's an enemy of France. That's not what he's about.
I know what you mean.
Right? So these things require more subtlety and mercy. Just the quality of mercy is what you have to, and humility about the subjects. We don't know enough about them.
I will add a couple of points here I picked up from the late Conor Cruise O'Brien, the famous Irish political philosopher.
Yeah.
Who, again, fits very much what you were just saying, Anton. There was so much about the cruiser that was admirable, heroic, gigantic. And there were other things about him, his anti-republicanism in his last 30, 40 years in his life and what it led him to, which I thought were quite ridiculous and abominable. But as you said, people like wider issues are complex, but he loathed Jefferson, and he had not gone into any of the aspects of Jefferson that you have discussed. I think he was ignorant of all of those, but he points out a couple of he focuses on one area of Jefferson, which reflected his own background. Cruise O'Brien loved revolution as a way to break up the British Empire and to bring justice in the world, and was very active in Ghana, building up the University of Ghana and education in Africa in the idealistic eras of the late 50s and early 60s. Then he supported the revolutionary movement in Northern Ireland in the 1960s. But from his perspective, it got too violent, it got out of control, and it threatened the very peaceful, even superficially idyllic life that he himself and his family lived in the Republic of Ireland. And this made him an arch reactionary for the rest of his life. He ended up being a strong supporter of the Unionist movement in Northern Ireland, and even of the British racist Enoch Powell, as I'm sure you're familiar with. Now, he had written a very subtle and sympathetic biography of Edmund Burke, and especially of Burke's role to expose the injustices of empire, still thinking, as Roger Casement, another great Irishman, did in his day, that you could humanize empire from within, and that this was the great Irish role in the British Empire. He writes this about Burke. But before he dies, he takes on Jefferson. He never ends up finishing his book on Jefferson. And I discussed this with him once. No, he writes a book, he publishes it in Jefferson, and it's a filled with hatred against Jefferson. But it's very simplistic. He doesn't bring in the dimensions of Jefferson, even the contemptible dimensions that you bring in. But he focuses on Jefferson's admiration for the French Revolution. And what he tries to document is that Jefferson imagined the French Revolution would go exactly the way the American Revolution had, moderately, within bounds, humanistically and constructively. Whereas Burke, using history as his model, saw the French Revolution as going like the English Revolution. And 8 years before Napoleon appears on the scene, Burke predicts the emergence of a French Oliver Cromwell, that the revolution will drown itself in blood and will be rescued by a tyrant who will start out as a military hero, and then he will only be able to give himself legitimacy by creating a new template of empire and conquest, such as Cromwell did for England. Burke is extraordinarily prescient about this. Now, Jefferson sees none of this, and Cruz O'Brien has a great time condemning Jefferson for this, and that's all there is in his book. But I had to tackle other parts of Jefferson for my book, Cycles of Change, and I was struck by how cynically and brilliantly Jefferson outmaneuvers Napoleon Bonaparte in negotiating the Louisiana Purchase, and in linking it to his support for the revolution in Dominican Republic. Jefferson doesn't want black slaves to win for the reasons that you get. He has a terror of black slaves by this point, and his own ambiguities in this have, of course, been very well documented. The relationship with Sally Hemings, the black illegitimate children he treats so abominably. All of this is documented, right?
I agree with you about not treating Jefferson as a demon.
Yes, he's complex.
The people who did treat him as a demon were these dishonest people in New England who tried to betray the United States on behalf of the British. They said Jefferson is a communist, he's an atheist, he's the devil.
That's where it comes from.
Yeah,
and of course,
it was the two-party system
would have been caught up in
that broke up the United States and actually prevented the industrialization. It was started by Jefferson, but then it was set into stone by his enemies, who were in the party that started with Hamilton, but Hamilton didn't run the Federalist Party. These guys did. That was what was wrong with the Federalist Party. And remember that Hamilton ended up subverting the election of Adams, the Federalist, where Jefferson became elected. And then when Jefferson was a candidate for president against Burr in the House of Representatives, where it was decided, Hamilton came out for Jefferson. So recognizing that Jefferson was not the devil, but that Burr was somebody who would destroy the country. Jefferson did not destroy the United States as president.
Yes, exactly. I fully agree.
Its development. He suppressed the development of the United States, and he relied on, in part, on the support of the oligarchs in New York and Virginia. But he also relied for his politics support, for his support of his political career, on a broader array of people who did not agree with that suppression of American development, like Matthew Carey and others who were patriots. And so they had to bide their time for a while he was president. And then when the British attacked in 1807 against this American ship, the Patriots in the Jefferson Party started to develop a full-scale nationalist movement to revive the revolutionary idealism. So Jefferson is what you say. He's a complex man.
Yes, yes.
But he definitely betrayed his own ideals.
Yes, yes.
To take the side of Southern interest. There's no doubting that. That cannot be denied. And again, with Jefferson, the same way as with we mentioned with some other person, I forget who we were talking about, but it was Soros. Don't get into his private life. That, to me, that's a trap. You start to get into, well, he had sex with a slave and had a child or children. How much about that do you know? How much about that is relevant? I think it's baloney. It might have been true, but I don't. It's irrelevant. The issue is, what do people do for mankind? And that's the issue raised in about the three religions in Martin the Wise. Is that the name of the book?
Nathan the Wise.
Nathan the Wise.
Yeah.
If you're having an argument, which is the best religion, Judaism, Christianity, or Islam? Well, let's wait 1,000 years and see what each of those religions have done for mankind, and that will decide it. In the meantime, let's treat each other with respect. So, don't focus on personal corruption or any of these other things, which you're not. Be humble about those things, right? And try to see the good in every person, but mainly see what are they doing for or against the welfare of mankind. If you have Adolf Hitler, somebody might say that he gave employment to the people of Germany. Somebody in my own organization years ago contradicted what I was saying about all the great advancements of human powers over nature were made by people who wanted to benefit humanity. And this woman said, well, Hitler developed rocketry. Now, that's ridiculous. I mean, it's ridiculous about Hitler's development of rocketry, that he didn't invent rockets. That's stupid. But he did pay people to make rockets into weapons of war. Where's you're going to say that there was a German space program under Hitler? Only Goering was part of the space program. He took dope all the time, so he was in space.
If I can just.
All right. Well, no, wait. Hold on a second. Because we have 4 people on the queue dying to ask a question, but we're also running a little over our scheduled time. So, Anton, I have to ask you, what does your time look like? Do you have room for 4 more questions?
Give me a minute, and I'm going to ask my wife.
Okay. Yeah. Get permission.
I'm full time.
Okay.
Mark, if I can just chime in there again, just in full agreement with Anton's point, his timing for me is uncanny, because I'm working for my current book right now, literally over this weekend, on a chapter about dealing with Nikita Khrushchev as the liberator of the Gulag. And Khrushchev embodies exactly the complexities that Anton discusses, because and again, it's in his actions. He does the most admirable and extraordinary and heroic and visionary things. And he also has quite literally the blood of millions on his hands. And these are all clear in his actions. And again,
my wife is.
It's basically a confirmation, Anton, of your philosophical position of the.
My wife is crippled from a stroke, and I have to see to her needs. So I've only got another 10 minutes.
10 minutes?
Sure.
Okay. So here, let's race through 1 or 2. Let's see what we can do. So Scott, I know I had you waiting for a while. Scott,
I'm gonna give up my question. I'm gonna refrain from it.
Oh, Lazarus, I'm sorry, buddy. But you know what? For anybody who doesn't get their questions in, I'm going to make sure that everyone has Anton's email as well, that they can throw their questions at him. afterwards. So that's going to be there too. And maybe Anton will be gracious enough to offer a class in the opening of the new year at some point too. I'm a fan of that idea. Just putting you on the spot there. All right, so Scott, go for it. Ask a question.
Hello. Great presentation, Anton. As always, just mind-blowing. I had more prescient questions to ask, but now I've kind of been, but I still have one or two. One has to do with the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. To me, when I discovered this document, you know, it was like, you know, a viable piece of evidence to show against, you know, what the revolution was about, was to end slavery in a piecemeal, in a regulated way. And very few people seem to know anything about it, and it would be a very tactical thing, it seems, to bring it up versus this 1619 project, you know, operation. That's one question. The other one is,
can we keep that one? Keep it down. Can we keep it one? Scott. Can we keep it to one question, because we have very little time?
Sure.
Sorry.
Sure.
All right. So very quickly, Jefferson was the man behind that ordinance that outlawed slavery in the Western Territory. That was before he turned his point of view. And Colin Lowry is developing a major work of history, the son of Graham Lowry and Pam Lowry, on the question of the leadership in the United States of anti-slavery, and how the leaders of the patriotic movement within the colonies were anti-slavery, and that the direction of the Americans was anti-slavery, and that this was a question of empire versus the Americans. The whole 1619 project, it can be answered in one sense by the history of what the American Revolution was about. So I would urge you to Matt, to be in touch with Colin and really develop this as much as you can, help him get the story out or whatever. But this is very important.
That sounds amazing. Taking these lessons is really important, because we have to get people excited about the sacredness of the mind in a real way, because a lot of the most active, action-oriented people, whether it's on the Antifa side under Soros, or whether it's in a lot of Trump's support base in the ultra-libertarian side, there's no wisdom. There's no understanding of what is it really about human beings that make us, you know, worth fighting for and saving, and what is it about the mind? They haven't learned how to become excited about that. What is it that we do? What are we meant for? What are we wired for? So I think for me, looking at people like, you know, Dante Alighieri, looking at Ben Franklin, Ben Franklin, for example, I just named two big people, but Ben Franklin is a guy who, you know, he knew in the world of 1720s, 1730s, 1740s that there was an impossibility for an American revolution. You know, he didn't see it. He knew it wasn't culturally available to him, in spite of the injustices that the empire was imposing, restricting manufacturings and other things, you know, onto its colonies. But he invested his time so well, he was thinking so far ahead, right, on that higher plane of reality, that he took the time to discover he took the time to discover electricity, right, as a way to expand people's understanding of the universe, that awoke both the masses as well as the intelligentsia and the aristocracy across Europe, right? So he just created a bigger mental space in which the understanding of natural law and the political changes that would need to happen later could happen. So electricity and the revolution were two sides of the same coin. And I think we have to think in that higher long-term level, because we are falling into the British trap. Like, in many ways, the British are setting up, they want a civil war to break out. They really do want the Antifa nut jobs on the left to go and fight kinetically with the Trump support base. They want to dissolve the union that way. We know that. So I think we have to get into that higher simultaneity of eternity mode and really take our minds seriously and use our time really, really well to be effective communicators, teachers that can harness and awaken that power in other people in a real platonic way. And there's just not very many people who can do that, you know? So that's what I would say. And I mean, I'm in Canada. So, you know, at the same time, I'm not exactly as on the front lines as you guys, but definitely I think the Dante Alighieri approach, you know, what he was doing, creating a cultural environment, a unifying new language, his work on the Commedia, all of this was necessary. In a dark age, he did this. You know, there was nothing there for Republican movements in Italy at the time. There was nothing. And so he created a new higher level of culture that was then able to then create this seed such that the next generation was able to act in a new environment culturally that awoke the Renaissance. Unfortunately, I do think that that's a very important, not unfortunately, but I think that that's the sort of fruitful orientation, and practically there's not a lot of easy practical answers right now. There's a lot of uncertainty, and so looking for the practical, like what do I do practically, is there's not many openings, I think, to that. That's just what I got to say to end it. And I know people have been on for a really long time, and I thank everybody for their endurance and just enjoying this whole participation in ideas. And next week, Martin Seif will be delivering something on the British intelligence operations and the creation of color revolutions and anarchist movements that have led in the assassinations of people like McKinley, Tsar Alexander II, and many others before World War II, as a way to get a better insight into how some of these operations are underway today. So tune in and invite friends for Martin Seif's presentation. Cool? All right, amigos. Till next week.
Thank you, Matt.
Okay.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Matt.
Great class.
Thank you. Cheers.
Yeah.